Pre-trial starts not long after this, and the evidence that they've got against these two guys is mostly built around claims of things Tony Oleanick is said to have said to undercover officers, right? And then Chris Carber had this travel trailer, and they were storing rifles and stuff there.
Wait. Sorry, the case was built on things that was said to an undercover police officer, but you earlier said that they weren't wearing a wire or anything. So are we saying that the entire case was built on the word of a police officer as to what he said?
Not all of it, but most of it.
But they could be lying.
They could be. I think they are. I mean, a jury thought that they were making it up, right? So to condense this some more, pre-trial hearings go on. There's arguments about what evidence is admissible and what is not. There's questions about an envelope. Basically, the Crown prosecutor who is taking this to court was also at the protest site, right? So these two, there's one guy, Stephen Johnston, and another guy named Matt DeLittlewitz. They were on site in Coutts in an advisory capacity to the RCMP. And there's a question about directions that Stephen Johnston gave to the RCMP, which would disqualify him from prosecuting the case and also may have been illegal, right? So a bunch of the evidence, such that the government had any, is in question. However, there was a meeting between a bunch of the lawyers, Crown prosecutor, and the judge where this evidence was sealed and not admitted to trial, right? And there may be litigations on that in the future. I can't really talk about that very much, but there's some dodgy business going on with the government and how they prosecuted this case right from the word go. So they get Tony and Chris into trial. It goes on for a couple of months. It's a jury trial. The jury finds them not guilty of conspiracy to murder police officers, right? So basically, the government's story was a fantasy, a conspiracy theory, if you will, that they concocted in order to justify their imposition of the Emergencies Act. So what they did convict Chris and Tony on were minor charges unrelated to that. Well, I mean, I guess they're related, but they basically said possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose. Again, everybody in Alberta has guns. Coyotes, gophers, hunting, whatever. It's not a big deal. Tony Oleanick drove his own dump truck to the Coutts protest site. A friend of his drove Tony's pickup truck to the protest, in which he had a small bore 22 caliber, like a small game rifle, and a shotgun. Tony Oleanick is driving around at the protest site in his capacity as a sort of volunteer security guy, realizes he's got these guns there. He's like, oh, this is a bad idea. Asks his friend Chris Carbert, who's got a travel trailer half a kilometer away on the other side of the village, and says, hey, can I leave my guns in your trailer? Because I shouldn't have them at the protest site. Tony Oleanick tried to do the right thing, and then they tried to hang him for it, right? Tony Oleanick was charged with possession of a pipe bomb. This was a totally manufactured bullshit charge that they threw at him because the cops executed a warrant on Tony Oleanick's property 200 kilometers away from the protest site, where Tony used to operate a gravel quarry with his late father. They basically rip the whole place apart. They go into a built into the side of the hill storage unit, and in it they find this wooden box with two old rusty pieces of very small dynamite that they used to use in an industrial capacity. They were basically 10 years old or older. The government specialist on explosives said as much on the stand, rusted shut, probably never going to work. They had to break the thing open to test the powder inside. One of Tony's business associates testified to their use as industrial explosives, but because the cops said they never found a permit on his property for them, like a municipal permit, that means that he's guilty of possession of an explosive device, right?
That's a stretch.
So yeah, exactly. 2-hour drive away from the protest site, over a decade old, rusted shut, industrial explosives buried in a storage unit, and that got turned by the media and the government into pipe bombs.
So we're expected to believe that 10 years earlier they went out and bought some dynamite because they were expecting 10 years later to kill police at a protest site and they were just waiting for their moment to quickly pop 200 kilometers away and back again in order to carry out this heinous attack.
That's what they expect you to believe, and a lot of people believe it because
They're
yeah. Well, whatever political persuasion, but like I call them CBC Canadians. They've just all they do is they watch the heads on TV and they believe what they're told. They turn their brains off. That picture of all these assembled rifles on that table, there's a really famous photo. It turned everyone's brains off immediately. Oh, terrorists with guns, they're bad people. Like no further questions. And that propaganda photograph basically sealed these guys' convictions in the court of public opinion, like 2.5 years before the trial even started. So trial goes on. Yeah. So Tony gets convicted of like possession of explosives, and then they get, weapons for a dangerous purpose. But what's the dangerous purpose of the possession of those weapons? They were just cleared of any conspiracy to murder the cops. They had not. Chris Carbert had never said anything about it. The undercover officers found their paperwork, their claims of rhetoric of what these guys said they were going to do. They basically had nothing on Carbert. They put him in there in order to continue the conspiracy charge, because in order for a conspiracy charge to make sense, you need more than one person, right? It's my contention that most of the case that the government had against these four guys was built on Tony Oleanick. When they let the other two out because they literally had nothing on them, they had to have one more guy to get the conspiracy charge to stick, so they sent Chris Carbert along for the ride. Right? Wow. So, yeah, they get convicted on the smaller charges. Sentencing comes a few weeks later. This is where up to this point, most people believe that the justice overseeing this case, a guy named David Lebrenz, a very staid-looking, older guy with glasses, very thorough, sort of boring judge dude. Everyone's like, oh, he's okay, he's fair. During sentencing, it was proven that he's not, because during the sentencing, he basically relitigated, like part of the sentencing. If you look at the sentencing documents, he's talking about the undercovers allegations and the claims against these guys for the charge they were just found not guilty of, right? He's kind of relitigating that in order to expand the sentencing on the other lesser charges. And then in the case law he cites...
Surely there's absolutely no legal... I mean, there can't be a legal basis to do that. You can't...
I'm not a lawyer.
You can't increase somebody's charging its sentences for something they were found not guilty of.
Right. Well, again, the language is weaselly, but the sentencing was based on other case law, but the rhetoric and the way he talked about it,
right,
sort of, I think it was kind of a show for the Crown prosecutor, because like I believe that the justice was also trying to avoid an appeal from the Crown, because if a justice gets appealed by the government, that's kind of a bad mark on their own record and is going to impede their career arc, We'll get back to the judges and the lawyers involved here in a minute. But anyway, sentencing comes down. The Crown wants to throw them away for as much as they can. Lebrenz cites these cases. One of the cases that Lebrenz cites is about a guy who drives his pickup truck into the grounds at Rideau Hall in Ottawa, which is near where the Prime Minister lives. And this dude was like having a psychological breakdown, losing his job, losing his family. The guy was just clearly not having a good time. And he starts stomping around government buildings looking for the Prime Minister or somebody to talk to. He's got all these guns and stuff on him. The cops intercept him. Nothing happens. He's arrested peacefully. And, that gentleman was like looking directly for the Prime Minister carrying guns. Lebrenz compared that guy in the sentencing to Tony and Chris, who were standing around at a protest site drinking coffee.
Hundreds of kilometers away from the Prime Minister.
Thousands of kilometers away from Ottawa. So, it was sort of like, if you look at the sentencing, it seems pretty clear that like, and then you compare the things they were convicted of, they're relatively minor. The problem is that they were also convicted of mischief. And if you look at the other Freedom Convoy people who've been harassed and are continuing to be harassed to this day by the government, that's their favorite charge to throw at people, mischief. Under Canadian law, mischief is a property crime. It can get you up to 10 years in prison. But what the government keeps saying is that the property involved is streets and the public's enjoyment of that property, right? So in this one case with Tamara Lich and Chris Barber, the judge says that the very peculiar, that the enjoyment of the streets of Ottawa is of more grave concern than your right to protest or freedom of expression. It's pretty clear from the judge's ruling on that case. And
presumably this standard was not applied to regime-approved protests. If you had BLM there, presumably that was not applied then.
Oh, no. And Hamas enthusiasts who are protesting what's going on in Israel and Gaza have been protesting since October 7th, unencumbered in every city in Canada. I don't think any of them have ever been arrested for anything. And if they have, they haven't got the treatment that any of the Freedom Convoy people did. There's a clear hypocrisy there, or inconsistency at very least.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.